The way things change is because lots of people are working all the time. And, you know, they're working in their communities, in their workplace, or wherever they happen to be, and they're building up the basis for popular movements which are going to make changes. That's the way everything has ever happened in history, you know, whether it was the end of slavery or whether it was the democratic revolutions or anything you want, you name it, that's the way it worked. You get a very false picture of this from the history books. In the history books, there's a couple of leaders, you know, George Washington or Martin Luther King or whatever. And I don't want to say that those people are unimportant, like Martin Luther King was certainly important, but he was not the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King can appear in the history books because lots of people whose names you will never know and whose names are all forgotten and who may have been killed and so on were working down in the South. When you have active activists and people concerned and people devoting themselves and dedicating themselves to social change or issues or whatever, then people like me can appear, and we can appear to be prominent, but that's only because somebody else is doing the work. My work, whether it's giving hundreds of talks a year or spending 20 hours a week writing letters or writing books, is not directed to intellectuals and politicians. It's directed to what are called ordinary people. Yeah. And what I expect from them is, in fact, exactly what they are, that they should try to understand the world and act in accordance with their decent impulses, and that they should try to improve the world. And many people are willing to do that, but they have to understand. And in fact, as far as I can see, in these things, I feel that I'm simply helping people develop courses of intellectual self-defense.
What did you mean by that? What would such a course be?
I don't mean go to school, because you're not going to get it there. It means you have to develop an independent mind and work on it. Now, that's extremely hard to do alone. You know? The beauty of our system is it isolates everybody. Each person is sitting alone in front of the tube. You know? It's very hard to have ideas or thoughts under those circumstances. You can't fight the world alone. Some people can, but it's pretty rare. The way to do it is through organization. So courses of intellectual self-defense will have to be in the context of political and other organization. And it makes sense, I think, to look at what the institutions are trying to do and to take that almost as a key. What they're trying to do is what we're trying to combat. If they're trying to keep people isolated and separate and and so on, well, we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to bring them together. So in your local community, you want to have sources of alternative action. People with parallel concerns, maybe differently focused, but at the core, sort of similar values and a similar interest in helping people learn how to defend themselves against external power and taking control of their lives and, you know, reaching out your hand to people who need it. That's a common array of concerns. You can learn about your own values and you can figure out how to defend yourself and so on in conjunction with others.
Good evening and welcome to Dead or Alive. Tonight we're going to be talking about alternative political parties and citizen participation. I have with me a number of guests. On my left is Ron Barghouth, a libertarian candidate for state rep from a district in Somerville. Welcome. And next to him is Rosemary Sansone, former Boston City Councilor. Welcome. John Stith of the Green Party. Welcome. And Phineas Baxendall of the New Party. Thanks. Welcome. What you all have in common is a belief that we need more than just the traditional Democratic and Republican parties. To start our conversation, maybe we could talk a little bit about why you think that that's true. Ron, do you want to start?
Sure. You can't be represented the way you should be by just having two parties. You got two parties. The Republicans and Democrats right now are beginning to sound more and more alike. And a lot of people would join a party. You join the Democratic or Republican Party because you think that they match what you believe in, that this is your ideals and they're going to represent you. And then what ultimately ends up happening is you find out that they're not representing you, that this is not the way you would have had them vote on issues. And right now it's difficult. People are trying to turn to alternatives, and alternative parties are not getting the fair shake that they should have. And a lot of people, I just seen a poll they did just last month, they said something like over 40% of the people in this country would support a major third party. And there already are major third parties. There's the Libertarian Party, there's the Natural Law Party is on the ballot in over 40 states. I mean, there are big alternative parties, but because of the way the media has control over the political scene in this country, you don't hear from them, you don't see the candidates, and people just are not being represented. And people feel that the only way you can get a fair representation is to be in one of the big parties, and it's getting worse and worse. People are looking more and more for alternatives, and that's why we're here.
I think that after observing the process for over 30 years, that many people are disenfranchised from both parties. I'm a registered Democrat, but I've crossed over party lines on a number of occasions. And I think that since so many people feel disenfranchised from traditional Republican and Democratic politics, that there is an opportunity for alternative parties and for people to feel that there's a place for them to participate. It's going to take a lot of organization, it's going to take money, and it's going to take the media to start taking other people seriously. But I hope that through that process we'll educate more people about why they should take their vote seriously and why they should participate.
It seems clear that American people want deeper debate of issues. They want more choices. They want more ideas out there, and we just don't get that from the way the media is covering the two major parties today. I also think we want a way to have more control over our lives, and the control is going to the national level. It's in the federal government and big business. And for people to get involved in their communities is still it's too hard of a thing to do, and it's separated from politics. So I think third parties provide new ideas and new ways for people to get involved in their towns, and that's why third parties that work on the local level, we used to have Democrat and Republican precincts, and we'd have people going and knocking on the doors with the neighbors. You might find that in a few cities today, but most of the country that just doesn't happen. And I have parties that still do that, where people talk to each other about the issues. That's what excites me about alternative parties.
Yeah, I think it isn't so much that we need a third party, we need a second party. What we have right now is just two wings of one party. And people are beginning to realize this. People don't tune into the debates so much now because you've got two people saying almost exactly the same thing. And the American public is getting disillusioned with the whole process, largely because there really is just one party. And the reasons for this, people have already mentioned the media, but I think a lot of it has to do also with the way campaigns are financed, that it costs now many hundred millions of dollars to run for a major seat in Congress. That narrows the number of people who can do it. It certainly keeps it to the established interests, and similarly the people who are in make the campaign laws so that it's very hard to get into the process. I think we need to build up and create new parties.
Before we get into campaign finance, some people might suggest, well, why can't you just, if you got out and became politically active with your local Democratic Party or your local Republican Party, couldn't you change their platform? Isn't the process permeable in that sense that if new people come in with new ideas, they can affect, in proportion to their numbers, of course, where the party is going? And isn't the system malleable enough to represent people, and isn't it just that people are staying home? Might be,
There are groups trying to do that right now. The Republicans have what they call the Liberty Caucus, which Governor Weld is a member of. And they're people who have libertarian-leaning ideas, but rather than try to build up the Libertarian Party, they're going through the Republican Party, trying to do exactly what you just said, trying to steer the Republican Party back to what it used to be. The Republican Party used to be the party that wants to get the government, out of your pocketbooks and out of your bedroom and all that. But it's just not true. And a lot of people who were diehard Republicans are trying to bring the party back to that, and they formed the Liberty Caucus. And in the Democratic Party, there are the Democratic Socialists who are trying to pull the Democratic Party more to the left and bring it in line with socialist ideals, which is sort of what the party was founded on way back when. And so people do try that, but it's only, look at what Governor Weld went through just mentioning abortion at the convention. They weren't even going to let him speak because he's pro-choice, and that's a big rift in the Republican Party.
Our parties still aren't built on the model of people get together and talk about ideas, then do something about them in their communities, though. I mean, you can get involved in Republican and Democrat, and if you really devote your life with it, you could rise up, you could become an elected official. But when so many decisions are made nationally, there just isn't the opportunity. So part of the problem is the parties, but part of the problem is the way we've built our society and the way we've built our economy. So the problems go together, and it's not easy to work on them, but it seems like an obvious first step to make more than two major choices out there.
Mm-hmm. Progressives have been trying for a long time to change the Democratic Party, but where else are they going to go? Right? And as long as there's no other option for people to go, then the Democratic Party can just keep moving to the right, moving to the right, moving to the right, and if there's no other option, you've got to keep voting Democrat.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a political monopoly, similar to an economic monopoly. If people can't go anywhere else, then why should the party change to consider their...
But I think that's an opportunity. I think that if there are enough people feeling that there's no place for them to go within their own party, that probably is the basis for alternative parties to be formed. So while it's difficult for people to penetrate their own parties with new ideas, maybe when we talked about where is the constituency out there for new parties, that's the constituency. It's the frustrated, disenfranchised person who needs a place to go. And as I said before, it's going to take a lot of organizational skills and advertising and education and finance to make some of these changes happen. But there are disenfranchised people in both parties that would like to have a place to go that they can believe in. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think also the debate around alternative parties is, as they become stronger, how will it affect the traditional Republican and Democratic Party as we know them today? Will they begin to finally listen and begin to see if 46% of the American people think that there's a place for an alternative or third party, not to necessarily replace the Republican or Democratic Party, then obviously a lot of people are interested in listening to other people.
Do alternative parties have to run a national campaign? Do they have to basically become as large an organization, as large a hierarchy, as large a money-raising institution as the other two parties have become in order to be taken seriously or to have any political clout? And if so, does that entail some of the problems of large-sized bureaucracy and moneyed interests that are part of the problem now?
It brings on problems. And going to, our candidates have been, the Libertarian Party's candidates have been on the ballot in all 50 states for the last 2 elections now. And we realize going into it that we're not going to win, but that's not the point. The point of the whole thing is like you said, that this is to educate people. And the more that you can get a candidate on TV, the more you can get them on the radio and in the papers, the further it spreads out your message, basically. And the other side of that is that if you can't get a national candidate and you can't get your candidate on the ballot in all 50 states, then they won't take you seriously at all. You don't have a chance of being in the papers or in the debates or anything else because you're not a serious candidate.
Mm-hmm. We learned a lot on this from the Christian Coalition, even though the Christian Coalition couldn't be further from our philosophy. They have the national network that helps. They learn from one another. They have those kinds of economies of scale where they can provide resources. But they also realized something that people hadn't realized, is that 90% of American races are nonpartisan races. You don't even need to be part of it. And it really makes a difference if you win the water council, if you win the school committee. And they've now got it so that they can all but commandeer the Republican Party, because the Republican Party now depends on them. And that's a kind of building up strategy from the bottom without needing to run at the top that's been very effective for them. And I think it's a smart strategy, even if their philosophy isn't one which is shared by most of the American Republic.
The Green Party had a big debate this year about whether to run a national candidate, because we had never done that before, and our ethos is to stay local. But being able to support Ralph Nader and the attraction that he has as far as bringing people to look at the Green Party. I mean, he brought me to look at the Green Party, and I found that I was even more excited about the Green Party than I was about Ralph Nader. So it's been a chance for us to attract people who might not have heard of us before. And for us, that is the main point of having a national candidate is to educate people, as you said, and then of course to build the party for the future so that someday we could win the presidency or we could win, lots of local offices. It's building it for the next century.
Let's talk a little bit about the role of the media in this. I mean, you mentioned that a minute ago. Certainly in terms of the presidential debates that we just had, there's been a big hullabaloo about should Ross Perot be included and who makes the decisions. How does that play out in terms of excluding other candidates or the whole range of candidates or any kind of alternative to the two parties?
Well, that's what a lot of people didn't realize. We were talking about earlier before the show, that part of getting in the presidential debates is that you have to have a certain amount of media attention. You have to, but they take that into account. So basically, by ignoring a candidate, the media can pretty much decide who is and who is not going to be in the debates.
They're manipulating the outcome.
Exactly. And people allow it. We don't fight it. No one complains. They just sit back and say, well, geez, it's too bad that guy didn't get in. And not realizing that they're letting a commercial enterprise, which is all TV is, it's a commercial enterprise, they're allowing them to decide who gets into the debates. I mean, they might as well let Exxon or somebody else decide who's going to get in, because it's the same thing.
Which is going to be who owns the media now. Anyway.
And it happened in the primaries as well, and we just have to go back. The debate situation happened in the primaries, and even before the very first primary this spring, the media was already handicapping candidates as far as who seemed like a realistic candidate to run against Clinton. People remember in '92, Clinton was kind of the hand-chosen candidate of the media as the only realistic chance, without even listening to what the voters thought about that.
Well, and I think that people who are putting programs together are interested in how long an audience can pay attention to so many candidates. And they're interested in sponsors' time and whether or not people are going to change channels. So they're really interested in what the audience is going to be able to tolerate, I think, which is what also manipulates the situation.
Yeah, the fact that the media is very much a for-profit, very much a for-profit area, and it's owned by basically three media conglomerates which get to decide what goes on the air. That seems to be the problem. I mean, if it was the media deciding, but there was 150 different independent media centers, then they would really have to compete for our opinions. But
Well,
it's very
take
difficult.
the national conventions, for example, the Democratic and National Republican Convention. Do you think the delegates really had anything to say about what was going to happen up on that stage or at the podium for that length of time? Who was dictating what was happening? It's probably the TV people that were dictating what was going to happen. That's not the way it should be. So it's obvious that the media is dictating more than what they should, and that the people don't have as much of a say and participatory activity in what's going on politically anymore.
Well, people wondering why was Ross Perot getting all this coverage way back when. And people kind of forgot that, geez, this guy spent a couple $100 million of his own money, and it's the same deal. I mean, if you go to the TV stations and you buy, millions of dollars worth of airtime, they're going to throw you the free 15 minutes every night because you've already spent hundreds of millions of dollars. If our candidate, our presidential candidate, Harry Brown, with this whole thing, after the presidential debate, CNN News is airing, I don't know if you saw them, they had, after the debate, they had a kind of a mini debate. And they had Ross Perot on a half hour of just Ross Perot, and then a half an hour of other candidates. And they had our candidate, and the taxpayer candidate, and the Natural Law Party's candidate. And they kind of lumped them all together, but they gave Ross Perot his own half hour. And why? Well, it's because he has already given them a couple $100 million, and that's what it is. People forget, they say, well, geez, we got to get third parties moving and all this. People forget that politics costs money. And if you really want a third party to get someplace, you got to put your money where your mouth is. You got to support it.
Which is kind of an interesting maybe segue into campaign finance reform, because maybe it's not just campaign finance reform that we need, but media reform. Because as long as the media is going to be able to get away with what they get away with, then campaign finance reform, as far as I'm concerned, having been a candidate, raised money for other candidates, and raised money for ballot questions, campaign finance reform might be dangerous if we limit people's ability to raise money and get their message out. But I know my colleagues here might disagree with me.
What do you think? What do you mean that it might be dangerous?
Well, I think it favors the incumbent.
On Because they have an advantage already.
Well, they have name recognition. They can issue statements every day to the press because they're the incumbent.
Right.
I think it definitely favors the incumbent. It doesn't give the opposition an opportunity to get their message out.
Well, the current system certainly favors the incumbent just because the incumbent has the power to raise money, and then the money wins the election. So it seems what's been frustrating with campaign finance reform is it's been passed before. Various people will try and tweak it a little bit here, say, well, you can't spend in this way, you can't spend in that way. And it's frustrating. It seems like nothing works. It's been happening since the 70s. We think the only way to really limit spending is to say, to cap the total spending limits, because if you say, well, you can't spend in packs, then people, get individuals to bundle. There's always new ways to spin the form, but if you have to cap the total, it seems like the only way to do it.
Yeah, there has to be. Where I'm running in the 30th Middlesex District, which is basically just the middle of the city of Somerville. The woman that I'm running against, Pat Jalen, when she was first elected 6 years ago, she spent over $40,000 to get elected. And we're talking about 10 precincts. I mean, you can walk the whole district in a half an hour, and she spent $40,000 to get elected. That's outrageous. That's just totally outrageous. Think of how much more good that money could have done going someplace else than just being passed out in flyers and brochures, and it's ridiculous.
What did her opponent spend?
I don't know. I don't know
But
what
it's
they
not
spent.
really, in today's,
It obviously wasn't anywhere near that because I didn't get elected, so.
As long as candidates are raising money for their own campaigns, elections become more $1 one vote than one person one vote. If elections are really about every person having a vote, then we should be able to donate money to the electoral process, and that money gets distributed to candidates. I think that's the only way of reestablishing a true democracy.
well, the other thing about campaign finance reform is that if you limit the amount of money or put a cap on how much money candidates can spend, you can't forget that incumbents have an organization. They have people that are on their payroll that are obviously invested in seeing their boss win re-election. The opponents don't have that advantage. So I think that there are a lot of things that need to be considered, and the media and how they cover an incumbent during a campaign, and how much media coverage they're going to give that candidate, that incumbent.
Isn't the issue also where the money is coming from, and not just how much money there is, but you were suggesting a central pool where taxpayer money would finance all of the campaigns. That would not only potentially limit it in that each person has the same amount, but it wouldn't be coming from the tobacco industry or from Indonesia or from
Yeah, the number of Americans who contribute to campaigns is incredibly small, and it is not surprisingly those Americans who have a lot of money. I think it's the wealthiest 1% of Americans, I think, contribute something on the order of 90% of the money that goes to campaigns.
quite different than the tax situation.
Yeah, quite different than the tax situation, quite different from what's supposedly the one person, one vote situation.
Well, Senator Bill Bradley has even proposed a system just to start doing this for U.S. Senate campaigns, I believe was his proposal, where it wouldn't even be tax money, but it would be a voluntary check off on your income tax return. It's on the tax page, but it's not a tax. And he claims that we could raise enough money just to start with Senate campaigns through that system.
There are also proposals, for instance, that certainly the networks, use public airwaves, and they get, at a big discount from the government. I mean, they're basically at cost use of public, and that's probably true. I think you can make the argument of all media, that to a certain extent it needs to serve the public because it's using public. So to some extent, we wouldn't even need to raise more money to pay the TV stations if we just required that they gave X amount of minutes to each candidate per week for the 3 months leading up to the election or whatever. That it's not necessarily that we need to generate more money and raise taxes
Right.
to create this kind of fund.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that much money. I mean, there's this initiative going on in Maine, which has this kind of capped spending limits, and it would have the option of public financing. And people make a lot of noise about the option of public financing, but that would mean about $5 or I think it's actually $15 per citizen in Maine. And $15 a person, compared to the amount of money, that gets generated now flooding the airwaves with soundbite television commercials, it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, we're going to go to a tape now of Howard Zinn talking about some of the history of alternative parties, and then we'll come back and look more closely at the individual parties that you represent. Let's go to that tape.
What is going on today is that a profoundly undemocratic consensus has developed between the Republican and
Doesn't it? I
Democratic
told you it
parties.
goes fast.
I say undemocratic because all the surveys of public opinion that have taken place since the mid-1980s, from then until last year, show that on the major issues, the public has very different views than either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And the views that the public has do not at all correspond to the idea that we should have rollbacks in Social Security or aid to mothers with dependent children or education or health, Medicare, not at all. And so the Republican and Democratic parties are really ignoring what people want. And who are the interests represented by the Democratic and Republican parties? And I think the answer is, we've known for some time, it's been sort of established in American politics, that the Republican Party represents the wealthiest sections of the population, represents Wall Street and financiers and corporate wealth. But for a long time, there was the illusion created that the Democratic Party was very different, that the Democratic Party was the party of the small man, woman. Woman was secondary, of course. But the Democratic Party was the party of the working man, of the lower middle class person, and even of black people and the ethnic groups. This is I suppose, a view of the Democratic Party that came out of the New Deal period, when the strong reforms of the Roosevelt administration and the Depression did in fact give help to the lower classes of the population. And an idea reinforced by the 1960s and the period of Lyndon Johnson, when Medicaid, and Medicare, and when the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were put into effect to help at least a number of people at the lower income levels. But in fact, the Democratic Party has always been a party dominated by wealthy interests. Even if you go back to that period when the Democratic Party was closest to being a populist party, that is the period of the 1930s and FDR and the New Deal. Even at that time, the wealthy classes were really divided between Republicans and Democrats, and there were many wealthy interests that supported the Democratic Party and supported the reforms, and they supported the reforms because they were afraid of something more radical, more far-reaching. And this is a constant in American history, and that is reforms promulgated by the national government, supported by important elements of the corporate classes and of industry, supported for the reason that they are afraid that if these reforms are not put into effect, people will demand much more drastic changes in the economic and social system. I mean, you can carry this back, if you don't mind my doing a little history, okay? You can carry this back to in the 1880s, when Grover Cleveland was president. There began what is probably the first of a series of regulatory acts passed by Congress, which became law, the Interstate Commerce Act, which was an act to regulate, well, railroads, and based on the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And farmers had been creating a great popular movement, farmers' alliances, the Populist Party, the People's Party, a great national movement protesting against railroad rates, protesting against the high prices charged to farmers and so on. And they were a formidable force in the 1880s and 1890s. Well, in response to this, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed to say to the farmers, you see, we're regulating the railroads. But in fact, Richard Olney, who was a lawyer for the railroads, wrote at the time to the railroad interests who are worried about being regulated. And he said to the railroad interests, don't worry, it's no big deal. This will soothe and satisfy those people who would demand radical changes in the economic structure. And it really won't be enforced very much. Well, this pattern is a historic pattern, and that is reforms passed, which, well, some of them are helpful and some of them are useful and better enforced than the Interstate Commerce Act, you know, like the Social Security system. And yes, they are real and they help people, but very often they are supported also by the wealthy classes, or by part of the wealthy classes. Part of the wealthy classes is very selfish and short-sighted. They don't want to give anything. There's another part of the wealthy classes which says, oh, let's give a little in order that we don't lose more. You see? But the point I'm making is that both Democrats and Republicans have always been closer to the corporate interests of the country, to the industrial giants and financial magnates of the country, than they have been to the common people. The difference between them has been that the Democratic Party represents that section of the corporate interest that is more willing to give reforms, and to make small changes in the system in order to forestall large ones. And this fact of corporate connection with both major parties has become much stronger in recent years. And by that I mean that since the New Deal and since the year 60s, the Great Society, the Democratic Party has been more and more dominated by corporate interests. The last two Democratic presidents, that is Carter and Clinton, show this, you know, very, very clearly in the appointments they make and in the policies they follow. And with Clinton, we find that the campaign contributions given by corporations, where the pattern used to be that you would find much, much greater corporate financing of the Republican Party than of the Democratic Party, now they're virtually equal. You find corporate financing of both parties roughly equal. The corporations are playing their cards on both sides on the supposition that whoever wins the election, they win.
Welcome back. So now we're going to, welcome back. Now we're going to go around and hear a little bit more about the different parties. Let's start with you in the new party.
Well, the new party is not only fairly new to America, it's quite new to Massachusetts. It's been around less than a year, and it's grown quite quickly to about 500 members in Massachusetts. And the new party, like our national strategy, we run very small offices and then build up. So this is a year where there's not many small office elections. We'll probably in a couple years you'll be seeing us running state rep elections, but right now, given the fact of what kind of elections were out there, we're running a ballot question and a city council question. And the ballot question is something in Finneran's district, the Speaker of the House. And what we've instructed him to do is a kind of comprehensive campaign finance reform. And so it's something that would be of the sort that I've talked about, the sort that's hopefully going to be passed in Maine. And that's been a lot of effort getting out there. We've got a whole core of people now in Dorchester, Mattapan who are excited about the new party. Actually, Somerville is actually a pretty big place for the new party as far as the demographics across Massachusetts, and as is Cambridge. But the new party is different than a lot of other sort of white, liberal, left parties in that we really have not only a lot of trade union support, but we are 40% non-white, half sort of real working class, non-professional. 3/4 of us belong to neighborhood organizations or unions. It's sort of different than what might be the typical sort of Birkenstock lefty political initiative. And that's something which got me very excited about the new party. Right now I've been working on these campaigns. The other campaign, as I was starting to say, is this fair living wage campaign. The living wage campaign would say simply this, that any corporation or company that gets subsidy, land subsidy, tax subsidy of, I think it's $5,000 or more, has to pay a wage that would that would keep a family of 4 out of poverty. Basically says, if you want our subsidies, you've got to pay wages that are decent, humane wages. And
I'm not sure what you mean. What kind of companies get the subsidies that you're talking about?
well, it's actually quite a lot of subsidies. This would affect about 120,000 people. So there's extensive money that goes kind of tax incentives, free land that the city gives out. It's something which people aren't aware of, is how much taxpayer money gets poured out to different kinds of business interests, partly because there's the threat that businesses will go elsewhere, that business plays off government, business funds most of the campaigns, as we've talked about. So part of what's great about this kind of campaign, and is different than something like just a minimum wage, is it not only focuses the fact that needs and wages have to be tied together, but it also focuses on the substantial kinds of corporate welfare that are out there at the moment.
And is this initiative here in Massachusetts?
This is an initiative which is in the Boston City Council and has some support from some council members. The mayor is basically waiting to see if other people support it, but there's a coalition of groups who are working for that, just like there's a coalition of groups working on this ballot question. It's actually in 24 different districts. The new party just started in Finneran's district because there's a lot of power there. There's a real base, ethnically diverse kind of base that we want to be working on. So we just started. We have this growing membership. We want to be one of the major parties in 20 years. In 20 years, I don't know if it won't be the Democrats there, if it'll be all 3 of us there. Hopefully it'll be all 3 of us. One of the things we work on is changing the kinds of rules of how campaigns can run. We have something before the Supreme Court having this kind of cross-nomination fusion. We can talk about that more later if you want. But
How would you characterize the new party? I mean, what kind of image would you give people to, like, what are your issues? How are you different from the other parties?
Well, in our principles, we're actually probably quite similar to the Greens in terms of we support things like national health care. We support livable wages. We support economic justice. We support making business more accountable to the people. These are issues which actually have tremendous economic support, and groups like the Green Party or the New Party in this way are not at all extremists. These are, polling data will even confirm things like this about wages or universal health care. It's very much core issues that are neglected, but it's things which aren't being addressed. It's our sort of bumper sticker kind of slogan is a fair economy, a real democracy, new party. And I think that if you want a synopsis, let's say it.
Thanks. John, do you want to talk about the Greens?
Sure. The Green Party is only a part of a larger green movement that's really going on worldwide. It started maybe 15 years ago, especially in West Germany and New Zealand, where people were really being concerned more and more by how bad the environment was getting. And the first strength of the Green Party was really from the environmentalist movement. The first Green meeting here in the United States was in 1984, and so for the past 12 years we've been building, and we have state parties in most states now. What makes the Green Party different is first a different sense of how to do politics. Instead of having a national party where the national leaders make the decisions, we try to build local groups all over across the country that get together and talk about issues. And if people run for office, they're accountable to those local groups. For example, there are several locals here in Massachusetts. There's one in Martha's Vineyard and one up in the Merrimack River Valley, and 2 here in Boston. So the key is for the locals to control the national party, not for the other way around. And then we push other ideas that come from that, the idea of people being able to get more involved with their communities, and that means bringing government and business decisions more to the local level. Decentralization is a key word for us, a key value. also community-based economics.
I think the Green Party is very well known for its ecological perspective, but people, I guess, might wonder, do you have opinions on a broad range of issues, or are you largely trying to focus concern about one particular kind of thing, or?
I think we started as environmentalists, and then we realized how everything else was involved with that, and how you could take an environmentalist ethic and apply it to the fact that people don't feel like they're in control of their lives anymore. And until large government and large business, the power that they have to destroy the environment, but also to take control out of everybody's everyday lives is reduced, that people just aren't going to be able to be effective, that you don't have true democracy, you don't have a true civil society working together to build a better country. So some states have written platforms where they're very detailed about their issues, but many other states have just stuck with principles that we have. We have 10 key principles, and it has to do with environment, but also with community-based economics, feminism, respect for diversity. And we talk about these principles and come up with ideas. So we don't have necessarily a list. We haven't sat down and decided, okay, we're definitely for universal health care as a party.
You don't have a national platform.
No, we don't have a national platform. But of course, candidates that run do have a platform. Charles Laws is a candidate for Congress from the 10th Congressional District, which includes Quincy and the South Shore and Cape Cod. And he has issues that he's pushing for, addressing violence, the causes of violence in communities, making government information more accessible, shutting down the nuclear station in Plymouth. And instead of having a brochure that just lists points, he has discussions and questions for people, and he wants to hear back from people about what's going on. And of course, on the national level, our presidential candidate this year is Ralph Nader, and our vice presidential candidate is Winona LaDuke. Ralph Nader has been an activist for a number of years. A lot of people know what he did to make cars safer in this country. And Winona LaDuke is a Native American activist, and she's been very active in trying to get tribal lands back. And they have platforms that they put out. Ralph Nader is for universal health care, for example. But those aren't necessarily a National Green Party platform now.
I'd like to let Ron talk about the Libertarian Party, but after that, I'd like to talk about just voter dissatisfaction and why we have this conversation going on in the first place.
Okay. We celebrated our 25th anniversary this year, the Libertarian Party. We are organized in all 50 states. We have major party status, which means we have ballot status. Our candidates are automatically in the ballot in 22 states. This year, our candidate is Harry Brown, and anybody who listens to talk radio, I'm sure, has heard about Harry Brown. Our party is based on two philosophies. The first is, as long as you're not violating the rights of others, then you should be allowed to live your life as you see fit, without government interference. The second philosophy is, no individual, group, or government has the right to initiate violence against any other individual, group, or government. And that we look at every issue from those perspectives. We stand for individual liberty, self-responsibility, and freedom from government on all issues at all times. And the national platform, Harry Brown has been asking the big question is, if you could give up your favorite federal programs, and in return for that, would you give those programs up if it meant that you never again had to pay income tax? This is one of the first things he would do if he was elected president, that the Libertarian Party stands for, is tearing down the IRS. That would be the first thing to go, repealing the federal income tax. And if anybody knows the history of how we ended up paying income tax would understand why. Because when they first tried to pass an income tax, it was ruled unconstitutional. So what did they do? They added an amendment to the Constitution, I think it's the 18th Amendment, saying that it's okay to tax people's income. So now it's not unconstitutional anymore. And we don't buy it. We still believe it's unconstitutional. Our platform is based solely on the Bill of Rights. And we support all 10 amendments. We are opposed to gun control. We support an individual's right to choose regarding anything. An abortion, see, this is the other thing that people get caught up in, is morality. We don't think anybody has the right to force their morality on their neighbor. So when it comes to an issue like abortion, the issue is not, is abortion right or wrong? The issue is, does a woman have a right to choose an abortion? And of course, a woman has that right, regardless of what I think or what you think or what anybody else thinks. You know, and to paraphrase Gene Burns, who spoke a couple of weeks ago in Boston, if you don't have the right to be wrong, then you don't have any rights at all. And that's what we're about, is that people should begin to take responsibility for their own lives. You know, we don't support corporate welfare, just like the new party, but we also don't support social welfare. We don't support welfare of any kind. We don't support the concept of socialized medicine. We don't believe the federal government should be involved in anything beyond their powers that are explicitly given to them in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say the federal government has the right to have a Department of Energy and a Department of Education and a Department of Public Welfare and a Department of everything else. Those are powers that they took on themselves, and by doing so, they took away those powers from the states. That's where all of this is supposed to reside. The federal government has two basic functions: defend the country and defend our rights. That's it. That's all they're supposed to do. Everything else came afterwards, and that's what we want to return to. We want to return the federal government to its constitutional limits, which no one's even talked about in 80 years.
It's certainly not a big issue in the debates.
That's right. That's right. All they want to talk about is, you know, people are all upset because the Republicans wanted to just cut the rate of growth of Medicare. They were screaming, they want to cut Medicare. They didn't want to cut Medicare. All they wanted to do was slow down the rate of growth. Instead of letting it grow 8%, I think they wanted to let it grow 4%. And people went crazy over this. And you can't, this is part of the problem, is you can't go in and say, okay, we'll cut this program and leave the rest. You can't do it. You have to do it all at once.
You're saying you have to dismantle the whole thing.
All at once, because one person is going to say, well, why are you picking on us? You know, what about all these other federal programs? And it's true, because none of them should exist in the first place.
Thanks.
You know, and that's where we're at.
Great.
Well, you know, I've been listening to all of you, and I'm impressed by the fact that you're all participating and active and believe in what you're doing. And I've spent most of my life trying to encourage other people to do that in the electoral process. But one of the things that I think has kind of eluded us in this conversation tonight has to do with leadership, and how people are not only looking for alternative parties, but looking for real leadership. And where do we go for that? The media has done a wonderful job in destroying the character of most people that we think of as our leaders. And I think people have become very, very discouraged with politics and the electoral process because of this phenomenon. And I think people are trying to take control over their own lives and are trying to really keep it simple because of all of the economic constraints that are upon us today. But there is a place for people to get involved, and your philosophies, while they may be different from mine, and maybe not so different from mine, are important for people to hear, and a show like this is an obvious opportunity for people to be engaged in listening and maybe participate. And ballot questions, in some ways, have played a role in the past, referendum questions, for people to get engaged in something that they believe in. But I think that leadership and what people believe in today is getting very, very confusing, because most of what we hear candidates talk about scare most people to death. If we talk about Medicaid, if we talk about Social Security, if we talk about programs ending, people really don't know what to believe because they don't know enough about how the government works. And that's unfortunate. You know, we talked earlier before the show about organizations like CP PACs and Common Cause and the League of Women Voters, who used to, 20 years ago, it seems to me, do a pretty good job in educating people about what was going on. And somehow that's escaped our process, from at least my point of view. And as I said, I've been playing around in this game for about 35 years. And I think it's unfortunate. You know, I think about young people and what they're going to have to believe in when they see all these people fighting over things that their parents don't understand or their grandparents don't understand. I think that we're in a place where to build that constituency, it's there to be built because people are feeling disenfranchised, afraid, and looking for someone to lead. And we make choices for president out of voting against someone rather than voting for someone.
Right. And one of the biggest things, it seems to me, that has always bothered any kind of alternative party is the fear that people have that it's just going to be a symbolic vote. you know, I like what you're saying, but I don't want Dole to win, so I'm going to vote for Clinton, or I like what you're saying, but I don't want Clinton to win, so I'm going to vote for Dole, because you don't really have a chance anyway. And I'd like you to address that issue, and then sort of leading into ideas about fusion, which would be like one alternative, as well as, you know, some of the other ideas about how can your parties, I mean, do we have to wait till you become a mega party before we can take you seriously? And how will you become a mega party if no one's going to take you seriously to begin with?
That ties into leadership so much, because I think of leaders as people who at first are willing to lose. You know, you're not going to win your first time out, and that goes for politicians and for social activists and for voters as well. I mean, I think if you're going to lead as an example to your friends and your neighbors, as, you know, because your vote's going to get counted and people are going to know how many people voted for the losing candidate, you've got to be willing to vote for who you really believe in, and you have to be willing to, as a politician or a public servant, to stand up for what you really believe in, lead by persuasion. And eventually that might, if you manage to persuade everyone, you'll be on the winning path and you'll be the leader that you meant to be. But you can't lead by always trying to follow public opinion, and you can't lead by playing into the media trap of letting everyone be cynical about you because you're following instead of leading.
Yeah. It boils down to what people can respect. You know, people, it's difficult for people to respect someone who keeps flip-flopping back and forth on issues and who doesn't take a stand on something. Even if people might not agree with you, if you take a stand and you stand up for what you think is right, they're at least going to respect you. And that's what is missing a lot. And it's like you said, you know, geez, well, I voted this way, you know, that year, but now a couple of years later, they're voting the opposite way, and people just don't know who to turn to anymore. And that's what's happened.
I can respect, though, how voters, given there's two choices, given that it's the lesser of two evils, always, you know, make this timid choice. One of the things that was one of the ideas behind the new party is that we didn't want to be yet another third-party electoral image that asked people to either be spoilers or to waste their votes. I mean, that's, when you talk to people about third-party, people say, I don't want to be a spoiler. I don't want my lesser of two evils to lose because I supported this symbolic, this pie-in-the-sky dream. Or people say, well, I want my vote to count. I don't want to waste my vote. And you know, there's something reasonable in that. And I mean, it's with that kind of reason that the new party has only picked races that we think we can win. And so we've entered 140 races, and we've won 94 of them, you know, which is a very good kind of odds. It's, you know, only picking where we think we can win. A lot of it, as I started to say with fusion, is this thing where you need to get a certain number of large wins before people take you seriously. And fusion, until the turn of the century, was the norm. And in fact, it's even powerful in some places. Kennedy wouldn't have won New York, FDR wouldn't have won New York, except for fusion. There was, in one case, for FDR's case, it's the American Labor Party. Kennedy's case, it was the Liberal Party.
Can you explain more about what fusion is?
Oh, I'm sorry. If fusion is something, let's use that New York example. You get FDR on the ballot twice. So it says, on your ballot, it would say Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Democrat. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, American Labor Party. And so if the returns might be that FDR got 48% of the vote from the Democratic Party, and he got an additional 5%, let's say, I don't remember what it was, but from the American Labor Party. What that means, I mean, it's different than if he just won 53%. It's different for one reason, what you're talking about, people can vote their conscience. They can vote what they really believe in. But it also is different for accountability. It means that FDR, when he's in there, can say, I'm not going to win this next election if I don't have the American Labor Party. It provides that kind of bridge between being, you know, us here on Somerville Community Cable and us being someone that people take really seriously, a household name. You know, it's ridiculous that you're on 50 states ballots, and most people probably don't know your candidates. You know, we need these kinds of mechanisms to make that bridge.
We only have about 5 minutes left. So I'd like to give each of you a chance to, you know, if there's something you'd like to say to voters, either about your party or about the need for broader democracy.
Sure, I'll start. People, like he had said, that people think they're going to waste their vote. Because of the way presidents are elected in this country, I can tell you right now, without a doubt, Bill Clinton is going to get every single electoral vote in the state of Massachusetts. We all know this. No matter how you vote, Bill Clinton is going to win Massachusetts. But if you vote for an alternative candidate, what you're doing is allowing that candidate the opportunity to bring their party into the majority in the state. Now, for instance, for any one of the parties that have a candidate on the ballot, if you can manage to get, I think it's 5% of the vote for your presidential candidate in your state, your party automatically gets ballot status from that. All right, so if you go in and you think, well, geez, I really don't want to vote for Bill Clinton or for Bob Dole, look at the alternative candidates and vote for them. No, if you're a Democrat and you've always voted Democrat and you're just thinking this year you don't want to do it, don't. Bill Clinton's still going to win Massachusetts. But by voting for an alternative candidate, you're helping them bring that party
So
up.
it's sort of a vote for democracy in
Exactly, exactly. And the more people that realize this, the better off we as alternative parties will be.
Thanks.
I would just like to remind people that if they see something in the paper, if they read something in the paper that they don't believe in, that everybody has the right and responsibility, if they want to take it, to write a letter to the editor and disagree with something and to state their opinion. If people have a representation that they disagree with, they have the right to call that representative, to write to them, to voice their opinion. I think that while we're talking about people being disenfranchised, people also need to take responsibility for what's going on. And there are a lot of steps that they can take that are made available to them.
Thanks.
This year is so exciting for alternative parties. A Gallup poll last month showed 6 different presidential candidates with at least 1% of support. And it's the Green and Libertarians and Reform and the U.S. taxpayers, and then the Republicans and Democrats as well. And if that happens on Election Day, it'll be a new record in this country. We've never had 6 candidates with at least 1%. So, and that's going to happen on the local level too. We're clearly going to have a lot of local alternative parties win this year. So it's an exciting chance to get involved with campaigns. The best part is it's a chance to get out and talk to people. It's an opportunity. And I think that's what a lot of us see it as. And then after the campaign, to get involved in your community as far as community organizing on whatever issues that you're concerned about. And if there isn't a group that exists, start one. And the Green Party locals, once the election is over, will be beginning new projects in our localities to do that part of the green movement and leave the elections for another day.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo some of these things. If you don't like the news, go out and make some of your own. And for me, I heard about the new party. I joined them. If you like what Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn said, they're both new party members. If you're in Massachusetts and you want to become a new party member, I'd urge you to call 357-0270 and join. I did it just involved this year, and it's really made me less disillusioned about politics. I think you got to be in it to feel good about it ever.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. It's been very informative. That's been our show. Thanks for watching Dead or Alive. Tune in again next week.
Resources to create a society in which nobody is desperately poor. And that is the answer to the crimes of robbery and violence that we see all over the country. Instead, and this is interesting, they say we don't have money, but they're spending money for jails. They're spending billions of dollars to build more prisons. So, I mean, from the point of view of somebody who came from some decent planet, I'm assuming there's a decent planet somewhere, you see, and came down and looked at this, they would think we were mad, because they're right. I mean, mad. Take away money from the poor, make them more desperate, then use that money to build more prisons so that you can lock those people up when they become desperate. Well, we obviously need a new social movement in this country, which is based on the idea of using the enormous wealth that we have, wealth which is now being wasted on the rich and wasted on the military, using this enormous wealth to create a good society. There is a kind of what I would call a silent majority in this country that really, well, look, half the people don't vote. Obviously, they don't see much in it for them to vote. They don't care about either Republicans or Democrats. Even of those who vote, or those who go to the polls, how many of them are really enthusiastic about the candidates they vote for? I think there's a huge reservoir of feeling in the country that is for a change that neither Democrats or Republicans want. And the problem is to tap into that reservoir of feeling and to begin to organize it.